So far what we've learned is that cellular respiration, the overall process is that it takes glucose that was made during photosynthesis, and it breaks down that glucose into cellular energy in the form of ATP. Cellular respiration always starts with glycolysis that occurs in the cytoplasm. If oxygen is present, the products of glycolysis, particularly the pyruvic acid, will move into the mitochondria. First it goes through the bridge reactions, then it goes through the Krebs cycle, and then it goes through the electron transport chain. If oxygen is not present, however, what will happen to that pyruvic acid? It will definitely not enter the mitochondria. Instead, it undergoes something called fermentation. Fermentation, as it says, is anaerobic. In other words, there is no oxygen required. The anaerobic pathway is not very efficient in transferring energy from glucose to ATP. Well, of course that makes sense because we've learned that even after the Krebs cycle, which is in the presence of oxygen, the thing that really bulks up the number of ATP that are made is through the electron transport chain. So the glycolysis still produces 2 ATP and still produces pyruvic acid. But what happens to that pyruvic acid is it now undergoes fermentation. There are 2 types of fermentation. One of them is called alcoholic fermentation. The other one is called lactic acid. Yeast, which is a kind of microorganism, will perform alcoholic fermentation. Yeast will convert the pyruvic acid, don't forget the pyruvic acid is made through glycolysis, into either ethyl alcohol, which is also known as ethanol, when they run out of oxygen. Yeasts are used to make breads and to make alcohol. How does it start? Well, it still starts with breaking down glucose through glycolysis and turning it into pyruvic acid. Of course, we've already talked about how glycolysis produces 2 net ATPs and the 2 pyruvic acids. If no oxygen is available, the yeast will continue down the pathway and make a 2-carbon ethyl alcohol, or ethanol. It says, yeasts are used in this way in both alcohol and in baking industries. The alcohol obviously makes alcoholic beverages. However, the carbon dioxide is what causes doughs to rise. So if you look at a piece of bread, and after it's been baked, obviously, right? Before it's called batter, now it's called bread. If you look at the bread and you see holes in the bread, that is where carbon dioxide had been trapped. And that is what helps make the bread rise. It goes on to say that there is still the alcohol that's produced during that time, but because of the heat and the fact that alcohols have a very low evaporation point, they evaporate during the baking process. That's why we don't taste the alcohol in any of our breads. Okay, lactic acid occurs in muscle cells. It says, steps of lactic acid. Again, it starts with glycolysis. Takes that glucose, breaks it down into those 3-carbon pyruvic acids, still produces the net ATP. Now, if no oxygen is available, pyruvic acid will turn into lactic acid. The big reason why it is relevant to us is because we all in our lives had some point gone out and done a little extra exercise, whether it was you went for a long hike or you got on the bike ride, went swimming, did training for a sport. There are times where we've exercised and then the next morning we feel really sore. The reason why you feel sore or the reason why you get cramps is this buildup of lactic acid. Oh, wait, what happened? I was on this slide, I thought. There we go. Okay, so It says pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid by muscle cells when there is a shortage of oxygen. It is produced in muscle cells during strenuous exercise because the muscles are using up the oxygen that is present, and the body is not supplying the muscle tissue with enough additional oxygen. So think about when you're exercising, right? What do you need? You need lots of energy. Your muscles need lots of energy. So your glucose gets broken down first by glycolysis. You have oxygen available, at least at the beginning of whatever the exercise is. So your pyruvic acid goes ahead and enters the mitochondria and gets turned into lots and lots of ATP, ultimately through the electron transport chain. However, your body is using up that oxygen that is stored in your cells. And so at some point, you're going to have depleted enough oxygen through that chemical process of breaking the glucose into ATP that your body doesn't have the oxygen available anymore. Yes, you are trying to compensate. Your body at least is compensating because it starts breathing in, starts breathing quickly. Our bodies do try to get more oxygen out to our cells. But in the meantime, what happens in that gap? Well, what happens in that gap is that the pyruvic acid will stop entering the mitochondria, and instead, inside of the cytoplasm still, it will be turning from pyruvic acid into lactic acid. A buildup of lactic acid is what makes our muscles feel sore. It causes cramps because of the pH of the muscle reduces the ability to contract. When the oxygen returns to the muscles, the lactic acid will be converted back to the pyruvic acid, which will then be available to go back through aerobic respiration. Okay, so how did this anaerobic pathway develop when there's now this aerobic pathway that produces lots and lots of ATP? Why do we have, or not we like as in ownership, but why is there an anaerobic pathway? Clearly, it's not very efficient. Well, it's really because of evolution. At first, the organisms that were on this planet were microscopic, very small. Bacteria, for example, microorganisms. And so the energy requirement of you and your body compared to a bacteria is ridiculously different. Bacteria are very small. They don't need a lot of ATP to thrive. They need ATP. They have cellular functions, but they just don't need nearly as much as an organism the size of us, or even the size of a cat or the size of a mouse, etc. So through evolution, different pathways were developed because of trying to meet the needs of the different sizes of organisms. These photosynthetic organisms began to fill the atmosphere with oxygen, which stimulated the evolution of organisms that use aerobic respiration. The anaerobic pathways provide enough energy for small unicellular organisms, such as bacteria, but larger organisms have a much greater energy requirement that cannot be satisfied by anaerobic respiration alone. Larger organisms rely on more energy-efficient pathways of aerobic respiration. So then there is a comparison here of photosynthesis to respiration. The job of photosynthesis is to capture energy from the sunlight and to make glucose. The function of respiration is to break down that glucose and make usable cellular energy. Where does photosynthesis occur? In the chloroplast. Where does cellular respiration occur? It really should say in the cytoplasm and then mitochondria when oxygen is present. Reactants for photosynthesis, you have water, which is used in the light-dependent reaction, and you have carbon dioxide, which is used during the Calvin cycle. Here you have glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen gas. The glucose is used during glycolysis. The oxygen gas is used during the electron transport chain. Products. What does photosynthesis make? It makes glucose and oxygen gas. What does respiration make? It makes carbon dioxide and water. Please note that the reactants of photosynthesis are the products of respiration, and the products of photosynthesis become the reactants of respiration. So the chemical equation for photosynthesis is we have carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight will yield glucose and oxygen. And then we have the equation for cellular respiration, which is, let's see if I can make it a tiny bit bigger. Glucose plus oxygen gas will yield carbon dioxide plus water plus the 38 ATP if the oxygen was present. Okay, that's it.